Hi, and welcome to the second lecture of English Linguistics 315. Today we are going to talk about language learning as a human instinct. So, just as a reminder about our first lecture and where we ended the first lecture, what we talked about last class was we introduced linguistics and we talked about how language constitutes a profound biological mystery. And I said that throughout this semester, what we are going to be interested in is how do we actually speak a language? How do we actually understand a language? And what does it actually mean when I say that we are all expert language learners and expert language speakers? So, one thing that I illustrated towards the beginning of last lecture was that when you actually speak or understand a language, you actually just do it, and you are not aware of all the incredible computations that's actually going on in your brain. One way in which people have answered this question, and I said this is actually not the right approach to take, is to say that the way that we learn a language is just to memorize all these expressions. But I illustrated this with a sentence that you haven't heard before, and I said, well, if it had to do with memory, if you were relying only on memory, then you wouldn't have understood the meaning of that completely novel sentence that you heard in the last lecture. An alternative answer to the question of how we learn a language, I said in the last class, is that language is actually a human instinct. And so there are two things to this. One is that studying language is studying something special, and studying language is studying something intimately, genetically human. And I said one of your first reactions to this point may have been, how can language be an instinct? Many of us learn language from another human. It could be a parent, it could be a caregiver, but many of us have this memory of being taught a language. And the proposal that I said was something to do with an analogy in the bird species, namely the learning of bird songs in the bird species. And I said the proposal to learn a human language follows a very similar kind of trajectory. What is written into our human genes is not the ability to speak a particular language, such as, say, English or Spanish, but what is written into our genes is the ability to learn any human language as a first language. And as a caveat, whatever I say in this class has to do with first language, unless I specifically say that this is about second language. So, for first language, we have something that is already in us. We come with a mechanism to learn a first language. We are predisposed to learning a first language. Well, when you look at our physiology, the human physiology, we are physically adapted for speech. So you can actually see that many humans have a voice box, and this voice box is in the middle of our throat. And this placement is pretty accurate for speech because we are using our mouth and we are using organs connected to the mouth for speech. And we will see this in the next lecture. But apart from the voice box, or the vocal cord that we talk about, we also have dedicated areas in the human brain that are specific for language learning. But when you also look at other genetic kind of behavior that human beings actually display, such as walking and eating, we can see that many of these kind of things also follow the similar kind of trajectory as language learning, even though we have a conscious memory of learning to walk. For example, our parents videotaped our first steps, or us running, etc., or us eating, for example. So we have a memory of these kind of learning. A more interesting argument for instinctive behavior is that when you look at other instinctive behavior of human beings, you can see that there are a lot of characteristics that are similar to language and other instinctive behaviors. So we will see what these are in a minute. Let's look at the first characteristic behavior of genetic human behavior. The first one is that it is uniform across species. This is the first characteristic of any kind of genetic behavior, that these kind of instincts that are genetic driven are shared by all healthy members of the species. So, human beings, if they're a healthy human being, no matter what culture you belong to, no matter what religion you belong to, no matter what country you belong to, end up walking. It's not something that we made a conscious decision one day and said, today I am going to walk. It is something that actually happened developmentally at that particular stage. All healthy cardinals sing. It's the same thing with the bird species. The bird called the cardinal, they all sing irrespective of whether they choose to sing or not. So, similarly, when you look at language, language is also a behavior that is uniform across all languages. No known human culture has ever lacked language. And by language, I don't necessarily mean language as a written document, but it could be language as speech, language in some form of communication. It could be gestures, it could be the use of paralinguistic mechanisms, etc. But no known human culture in nature has ever lacked language. So even though societies have been, born deaf, deaf communities, deaf societies, etc., they have been able to invent languages of their own, such as sign language. Nicaraguan sign language is an example of this, spoken in the country Nicaragua. And when you look at expression and the way that languages express certain kinds of things, all languages have ways of expressing um, things, even though maybe the mechanisms to express these things are rather different, and the kind of words that we use to express these things may be different. So there is no language that is unable to express everything that is expressible in English, right? So it could be a different way of saying it, it could be a different way of constructing the sentence, but every language has a way of communicating the same kind of ideas, the same kind of expressions that our language, English, has. The second characteristic of instinctive behaviors is that it emerges much before necessity. Now, when you look at walking, for example, you can see the children at the age of, say, 14 months, or some of them walk a little earlier, some of them walk a little later, but 14 months is the average for walking. You can see that at that point, the children could still be carried. So, children um, could still be carried by their parents or their caregivers, yet they start to walk. So, there is really it's not a necessary behavior at that stage, but they hit that stage when they're developmentally ready to do so. The same way in the bird species, for example, zebra finches, they learn to sing before sexual maturity because a lot of bird songs are associated with mating calls, and so the zebra finch, or the call of the zebra finch, is a mating call. But they learn to sing before they reach sexual maturity and before they start to mate. When you look at language, you see that language also emerges long before the need to communicate is there. So, very often people think that language learning starts after the child is born, say at the age of 2. But language learning actually starts much earlier. Language learning starts when you are in your mother's womb, when the child is in the mother's womb. The child, by the time the earlobes have been developed inside the womb, can start hearing sounds from outside. So the mother's sound is something that is very familiar to the child when the child comes into the world, but also songs that the child listens to. And other sounds, such as the other caregiver's sounds, for example, are all familiar sounds that the child is exposed to before the child comes into the world. And the fascinating thing about language is that children actually acquire language by the age 4. So when you talk about learning and when you talk about having been taught a language, remember that you don't go to school until 6. I mean, you go to preschool between 4 and 6, but you really don't start school until you're 6. But by the time you are entering preschool, your language learning is complete. So you have learned your language from the time you were conceived to the time you entered preschool. So that's the really fascinating bit about language, that many children may have not yet mastered how to tie their shoelace or how to, give themselves a bath without the help of their parent. But you have learned something as complicated and as complex as language by the time you are 4 years old. The third characteristic of instinctive behaviors is that it is automatic. So, very often, things like walking and eating and other instinctive behaviors, they appear automatically. They are not conscious decision of the human brain or the human mind, and so they are unrelated to external events. So, you are not eating because you see another person eat and therefore you want to eat, but you are eating because it's completely automatic for you to do it. And similarly, birds don't decide um, to sing, they don't need any special encouragement to sing. They sing because they are automatically predisposed to doing so. And the same way, children don't decide that they want to learn how to walk, they just start to walk and they just start to do it. When you look at language, you can see that when language learning begins in the womb, it is not something that the child can actually give up after the child comes into the world and sees how complex language is. So, um, my favorite analogy to teach this is learning a musical instrument. So, very often I ask my students in class, um, if you play a musical instrument, how often did you have to play it in a week or in a month to be really good at it and not forget what you have learned? And very often the answer is if you have learned a little bit of piano or a little bit of violin um, or any other musical instrument, you have had to put in hours of practice in order to not forget what you have learned. But the cool thing about language is that you don't forget your language even if you haven't used it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months. So there are people who have gone to, part of the U.S. Army or the Navy, and you've been posted in other parts of the world where maybe you didn't have to use English as much as you would, and or you were exposed to other languages in the new country, and then you come back and you're away for 5 6 months, and then you come back and you start speaking English just as well as you did before. So when you look at language learning, for example, it is not something that you can actually give up. You can decide that you don't want to do anymore, unlike, say, tying your shoes or playing an instrument. The fourth characteristic is, and this is something that may come as a surprise to a lot of you, especially most of you who are education majors, that direct teaching does nothing to correct the mistakes of children. This is the same thing with other instinctive behaviors such as walking. Many parents often tell the child to start walking when the child shows signs of or interest in walking, but there's nothing that you can do to um, increase the speed of the process. It's a developmental thing and it has to happen when the time is right, and nothing that you do will actually help them walk faster. And it's the same thing with language. When a child makes a mistake in language and you correct the child, there is actually no evidence to suggest that this actually does anything to improve the language of the child. And there are many cases where children's errors are actually they're impervious to explicit correction from parents. I'm going to give you two examples. The first one is from a real life dialogue. So this is a dialogue between a child and her father. The child says, "Want other one spoon, daddy?" And the dad says, "You mean you want the other spoon?" Child says, "Yes, I want other one spoon, please, daddy." So the child is now interpreting this as, well, the adult wants me to use a polite marker. So the child introduces please, right? Please, daddy. Now the dad says, "Can you say the other spoon?" Child says, "Other one spoon." Now dad is going to try to break it down into smaller segments for the child. The dad says, "Say the." Child, "The." Dad, "Say other." The child, there's a typo there. So the child says other. Then the dad says, "Say spoon." Child says spoon. Dad says, "Now put it all together, the other spoon." Now the child says, "Well, I'll amuse you, adult, the other spoon. Now give me other one spoon," right? So what you can see is happening here is that the child is completely oblivious to the fact that what the child is saying is wrong, and what the dad is trying to do is to correct the child into saying something that's correct. Because in the child's brain, other one spoon is completely grammatical until he or she actually realizes that this is not how you would say it in real life. But until the child realizes that and comes to the realization of their own accord, the child is just going to do it, irrespective of what the father or the mother is going to say. Here is another example of a dialogue between a child and a parent. The child says, "Nobody don't like me." Now, what is ungrammatical from a standard English point of view is that this sentence has a double negation. So, nobody is a negative word, and don't has a negation in it. So, the mother says, "No, well, you have to say nobody likes me." Child says, "Nobody don't like me." Now, this goes on 8 times. Mother is now really exhausted and says, "Now, listen carefully, say nobody likes me." And the child says, "Oh, nobody doesn't likes me." So, what do you think the child actually understood from this dialogue? The child actually thought that the mother was upset with the child because the child wasn't using the correct inflection on the verb. So, what the child understands is, well, not the negation, the child still has a double negation, but introduces the s at the end of the verb. So, nobody doesn't likes me. So, what we have seen in summary in this lecture is that human language has a lot of commonalities with other instinctive behavior. And language learning might be like another instinct outside of the human species, and say the bird species, for example. So, there is evidence for language learning being very similar to animal communication or parts of animal communication. But there's also some more evidence. This is independent evidence from intelligence. So, a question that I want to ask at this point is, why do human children learn language when exposed to it, but not other organisms like cats, right? And I'm sure a lot of you have pets, either cats or dogs. So, take a moment to reflect if you have a pet, or if you have pet sat, or you've seen a pet in your family. Take a moment to reflect how cats or dogs respond to language. It could be a parrot or a parakeet or a hamster, if you will. Take a moment to reflect on how they're exposed to language. You talk to them the same way that you talk to babies, but they can't talk back to you, right? A very commonsensical answer that I've heard being given repeatedly is that, well, cats and dogs are not as intelligent as humans. Now, the intelligence argument to learn language is again a wrong way to think about this. The reason is language acquisition has nothing to do with intelligence. You learn a language irrespective of what your general IQ is, right? So it has nothing to do with intelligence. Now, language learning begins in the womb, and so there are two key factors to suggest that language learning is actually independent from general intelligence. The first one comes from specific language impairment, where individuals have great difficulty in constructing sentences. And the second one is from Williams syndrome, where these are people who have very low IQs of below 50, but they have super normal language competence, right? So these are the two kinds of evidence suggesting that language acquisition has nothing to do with intelligence, because both specific language impairment people and Williams syndrome people can acquire language, although some parts of it are missing. So the conclusion that we can draw is that language learning does not depend on intelligence, but it is tied to something which is already inherent in you, which is already instinctive in you. You actually come with this box to learn a language. You are predisposed to learning a language, or it's inborn in you, inborn in people. Well, one way to think about this, or a controversial way to think about this, is maybe if there is a genetic mechanism to learn a language, maybe we can actually identify a gene called the grammar gene or a language gene. And so, an answer to this is again, like I said, it's a very controversial topic at the moment. Um, we know that specific language impairment is a genetic condition, and scientists have studied specific language impaired people. They have learned about the genetic predisposition of these people. And what they seem to have is a defective gene called the FOXP2 gene. And this suggests that maybe it's the FOXP2 gene that is involved in language learning for healthy human beings. And interestingly, there's also a connection between FOXP2 and bird songs. So when you look at the study of bird songs, the genetic makeup of birds who actually sing bird songs, they also seem to have the FOXP2 gene. So to summarize the first module of this class, what we did was we started out on an inquiry about human languages. And I said that our ability to use and learn a language is a profound biological mystery. And that is why we do linguistics. That's why I study linguistics. And that is why I hope you will be interested in linguistics as well. And we are going to ask this question throughout the rest of the semester. What is the system of rules and expressions that underlie a human language? And one of the answers from this module is that, well, it is a uniquely human instinct, and therefore studying language is studying something special, and it is intimately connected to being a human. It is inside our genetic makeup. The proposal was that it is not that we are geared towards learning a specific language, such as English or Spanish or whatever is your mother tongue, but what we are capable of doing is to learn any human language as a first language. And I gave you a couple of different kinds of evidence for this. There are other physiological developments for language, such as walking, eating, etc. And language also exhibits key characteristics of other instinctive behavior. And the ability to learn a first language appears to be tied to a specific gene, which is the FOXP2 gene. This is where we end the first module of this class. What we are going to do in the next lecture is I am going to start the first subsection of linguistics, which is called articulatory phonetics, and I will see you in that lecture.